And today we are going over Chapter 20 of A People's History of the United States, written by Howard Zinn. Chapter 20, oh, I lost my spot. No. Chapter 20 is titled The 70s Under Control. This is a chapter that dives into public opinion. It talks a lot about how people were losing faith in the establishment, big business, government, everything. We kind of alluded to that in the last video of Chapter 19. But we're also going to see what the government did in order to get people to come back and the strategies that were implemented. Not only the strategies, but the conversations that were taking place within government as they realized that they were starting to lose control over the people. We have seen this time and time again, right? Revolt, control. Revolt, control. At this point, there's so many intersections of disappointment within society that everything is up for negotiation in terms of the people thinking like we have to just redo all of this, which again, it's as if we are living in the same timeline still, because that is a conversation that we're having right now. There are conversations about the draft, and there are conversations about the draft now. It's just super interesting to see the parallels. I intended to read this book to find parallels and to seek them out to make better sense of today, but I had no idea that it was going to be at this level. I had no idea. For those of you who had to read this in high school, part of me is like, wow, like shout out to your teachers, but also like my 17-year-old brain with this level of information, I don't know how I would have done, because I'm having a hard time processing this at this age. I cannot imagine what would have happened at 16, 17, but at the same time, it's necessary, and I wish I would have known a lot of this sooner, because it completely transforms the filter that you view reality through, and I think that that's very helpful. And as we will see towards the end of this chapter, there are literal conversations and organizations that exist where these top people from these institutions gather to think about what's going on in the world. And I'm not going to lean too much into conspiracy and stuff, but for so long, there have been people being like, oh, you know, there are a few people who make decisions that impact all of us. And I wanted to reject that so badly. I never wanted to give that much power to a few people, but truth is, this is how it's all been by design. It was designed for a few people to control millions and billions of people, because that's how money is concentrated, and that's how people can be exploited. I'm about to go on a tangent. Let's dive into chapter 20. In the early 70s, the system seemed out of control. It could not hold the loyalty of the public. As early as 1970, according to the University of Michigan's Survey Research Center, trust in government was low in every section of the population, and there was a significant difference by class. Of professional people, 40% had low political trust in the government. Of unskilled blue-collar workers, 66% had low trust. More voters than ever refused to identify themselves as either Democrats or Republicans. Back in 1940, 20% of those polled called themselves independent. In 1974, 34% called themselves independents. The courts, the juries, and even judges were not behaving as usual. Juries were acquitting radicals. Angela Davis, an acknowledged communist, was acquitted by an all-white jury on the West Coast. Black Panthers, whom the government had tried in every way to malign and destroy, were freed by juries in several trials. A judge in Western Massachusetts threw out a case against a young activist, Sam Lovejoy, who had toppled a 500-foot tower erected by a utility company trying to set up a nuclear plant. In Washington, D.C., in August 1973, a Superior Court judge refused to sentence 6 men charged with unlawful entry who had stepped from a White House tour line to protest the bombing of Cambodia. Undoubtedly, much of this national mood of hostility to government and business came out of the Vietnam War. Its 55,000 casualties, its moral shame, its exposure of government lies and atrocities. On top of this came the political disgrace of Nixon's administration as the scandals that came to be known by the one-word label, Watergate, and which led to the historic resignation from the presidency, the first in American history, of Richard Nixon in August 1974. It began during the presidential campaign in June of 1972, when 5 burglars carrying wiretapping and photo equipment were caught in the act of breaking into the offices of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, in the Watergate apartment complex of Washington, D.C. One of the 5, James McCord Jr., worked for the Nixon campaign. He was security officer for the committee to re-elect the president. Creep. Another of the 5 had an address book in which was listed the name of E. Howard Hunt, and Hunt's address was listed as the White House. He was assistant to Charles Colson, who had special counsel to President Nixon. Both McCord and Hunt had worked for many years for the CIA. Hunt had been the CIA man in charge of the invasion of Cuba in 1961, and 3 of the Watergate burglars were veterans of the invasion. McCord, as CREEP security man, worked for the chief of CREEP, John Mitchell, the Attorney General of the United States. Thus, due to an unforeseen arrest by police unaware of the high-level connections of the burglars, information was put out to the public before anyone could stop it, linking the burglars to important officials in Nixon's campaign committee, to the CIA, and to Nixon's Attorney General. Mitchell denied any connection with the burglary, and Nixon, in a press conference 5 days after the event, said the White House has had no involvement whatever in this particular incident. These people love to lie. What followed the next year, after a grand jury in September indicted the Watergate burglars, plus Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, was that one after another, lesser officials of the Nixon administration, fearing prosecution, began to talk. They gave information in judicial proceedings to a Senate investigating committee, to the press. They implicated not only John Mitchell, but Robert Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, Nixon's highest White House aides, and finally Richard Nixon himself, in not only the Watergate burglaries, but a whole series of illegal actions against political opponents and anti-war activists. Nixon and his aides lied again and again as they tried to cover up their involvement. It was a swift and sudden fall. In the November 1972 presidential election, Nixon and Agnew had won 60% of the popular vote and carried every state except Massachusetts, defeating an anti-war candidate, Senator George McGovern. By the fall of 1973, 8 different resolutions had been introduced in the House of Representatives for the impeachment of President Nixon. The following year, a House committee drew up a bill of impeachment to present it to a full House. Nixon's advisors told him it would pass the House by the required majority, and then the Senate would vote the necessary 2/3 majority to remove him from office. On August 8th, 1974, Nixon resigned. Gerald Ford, taking Nixon's office, said, "Our long national nightmare is over." Newspapers, whether they had been for or against Nixon, liberal or conservative, celebrated the successful, peaceful culmination of the Watergate crisis. "The system is working," said a longtime strong critic of the Vietnam War, New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis. The 2 journalists who had much to do with investigating and exposing Nixon, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, wrote that with Nixon's departure, there might be a restoration. All of this was in a mood of relief, of gratitude. No respectable American newspaper said what was said by Claude Julien, editor of Le Monde Diplomatique. I don't speak French, but I try. In September of 1974, the elimination of Mr. Richard Nixon leaves intact all the mechanisms and all the false values which permitted the Watergate scandal. Julian noted that Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, would remain at his post. In other words, that Nixon's foreign policy would continue. That is to say, Julian wrote, that Washington will continue to support General Pinochet in Chile, General Geisel in Brazil, General Stroessner in Paraguay, etc. Months after Julian wrote this, it was disclosed that top Democratic and Republican leaders in the House of Representatives had given secret assurance to Nixon that if he resigned, they would not support criminal proceedings against him. One of them, the ranking Republican of the Judiciary Committee, said, "We had all been shuddering about what 2 weeks of televised floor debates on impeachment would do, how it would tear the country apart and would affect foreign policy." The New York Times articles that reported on Wall Street's hope for Nixon's resignation quoted one Wall Street financier as saying that if Nixon resigned, what we will have is the same play with different players. Nixon resigned, but everything that the United States was doing, all the mechanisms stayed in place. It was just the figure that changed, but everything else remained. In the charges brought by the House Committee on Impeachment against Nixon, it seemed clear that the committee did not want to emphasize those elements in his behavior which were found in other presidents and which might be repeated in the future. It stayed clear of Nixon's dealings with powerful corporations. It did not mention the bombing of Cambodia. It concentrated on things peculiar to Nixon, not on fundamental policies continuous among American presidents at home and abroad. The word was out, get rid of Nixon, but keep the system. Theodore Sorensen, who had been an advisor to President Kennedy, wrote about the time of Watergate. The underlying causes of the gross misconduct in our law enforcement system now being revealed are largely personal, not institutional. Some structural changes are needed. All the rotten apples should be thrown out, but save the barrel. Indeed, the barrel was saved. One of Ford's first acts was to pardon Nixon, thus saving him from possible criminal proceedings and allowing him to retire with a huge pension in California. Lovely. The televised Senate committee hearings on Watergate stopped suddenly before the subject of corporate connections was reached. Corporate influence on the White House is a permanent fact of the American system. Most of it is wise enough to stay within the law. Under Nixon, they took chances. Many of these corporations gave money to both sides so that whichever won, they would have friends in the administration. One of the items not mentioned in the impeachment charges and never televised in the Senate hearings was the way the government cooperated with the milk industry. Listen to this. In early 1971, the Secretary of Agriculture announced the government would not increase its price support for milk, the regular subsidy to the big milk producers. Then, the Associated Milk Producers began giving money to the Nixon campaign, met in the White House with Nixon and the Secretary of Agriculture, gave more money, and the Secretary announced that new analysis made it necessary to raise milk supports from $4.66 to $4.93, a hundredweight. More contributions were made until the total exceeded 400,000. The price increases added $500 million to the profits of dairy farmers, mostly big corporations, at the expense of consumers, people who wanted to feed their children and their families and themselves. Whether Nixon or Ford or any Republican or Democrat was president, the system would work pretty much the same. A Senate subcommittee investigating multinational corporations revealed a document, given passing mention in a few newspapers, of course, in which oil economists discussed holding back production of oil to keep prices up. Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Corporation, 75% of whose stock was held by American oil companies and 25% by Saudi Arabia, had made $1 profit on a barrel of oil in 1973. In 1974, it was making $4.50. In the spring of 1975, everything that radical critics of American policy in Vietnam had been saying, that without American troops, the Saigon government's lack of popular support would be revealed, came true. An offensive by North Vietnamese troops left in the South by terms of the 1973 truce swept through town after town. 2 weeks later, April 29, 1975, the North Vietnamese moved into Saigon and the war was over. All these people died. All of these people were injured. All of this trauma created. For the fuck what? For what? Most of the establishment had already, despite Ford and a few stalwarts, given up on Vietnam. What they're worried about was the readiness of the American public now to support other military actions overseas because, of course, America, you get into one, you get out, you let people breathe for a second, you throw them into another one. It's fucking insane. In early 1975, Senator John C. Culver of Iowa was unhappy that Americans would not fight for Korea. He said that Vietnam had taken mighty toll on the national will of the American people. What seemed to be happening was that the establishment, Republicans, Democrats, newspapers, television, was closing ranks behind Ford and Kissinger and behind the idea that American authority must be asserted everywhere in the world. It was a complex process of consolidation that the system undertook in 1975. There was also a need to satisfy a disillusioned public that the system was criticizing and correcting itself. The standard way was to conduct publicized investigations that found specific culprits but left the system intact. Watergate had made both the FBI and CIA look bad, breaking the laws that were sworn to uphold cooperating with Nixon in his burglary, jobs, and illegal wiretapping. In 1975, the congressional committees in the House and the Senate began investigations of the FBI and CIA. The CIA inquiry disclosed that the CIA had gone beyond its original mission of gathering intelligence and was conducting secret operations of all kinds. For instance, back in the 1950s, it had administered the drug LSD to unsuspecting Americans to test its effects. One American scientist, given such a dose by a CIA agent, leaped from a New York hotel window to his death. It was also learned from the investigation that the CIA, with the collusion of a secret committee of 40 headed by Henry Kissinger, had worked to destabilize the Chilean government headed by Salvador Allende, a Marxist who had been elected president in one of the rare free elections in Latin America. When in 1974, the American ambassador to Chile, David Popper, suggested to the Chilean junta, which with U.S. aid had overthrown Allende, that they were violating human rights, he was rebuked by Kissinger, who sent word, "Tell Popper to cut out the political science lectures." The investigation of the FBI disclosed many years of legal actions to disrupt and destroy radical groups and left-wing groups of all kinds. The FBI had sent forged letters, engaged in burglaries, opened mail illegally, and in the case of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton seems to have conspired in murder. Valuable information came out of the investigations, but it was just enough, and in just the right way, moderate press coverage, little television coverage, thick books of reports with limited readership to give the impression of an honest society correcting itself. Listen to this. In 1961, the chief of the CIA's Covert Action Staff wrote that books were the most important weapon of strategic propaganda. The Church Committee found that more than 1,000 books were produced, subsidized, or sponsored by the CIA before the end of 1961. Thus, in 1974 through 1975, the system was acting to purge the country of its rascals and restore it to a healthy, or at least to an acceptable state. The resignation of Nixon, the succession of Ford, the exposure of bad deeds by the FBI and CIA all aimed to regain the badly damaged confidence of the American people. However, even with these strenuous efforts, there were still many signs in the American public of suspicion, even hostility to the leaders of government, military, and big business. Surprise, surprise! June 14th, 1975 was Flag Day, and President General Ford spoke at Fort Benning, Georgia, where the Army staged a march symbolizing its involvement in 13 wars. Ford commented that he was glad to see so many flags, but a reporter covering the event wrote, actually, there were few American flags to be seen near the president's reviewing stand. One, held aloft by demonstrators, bore an inked-in inscription saying, "No more genocide in our name." It was torn down by spectators as their neighbors applauded. This is what I'm saying. This could happen right now. If Biden goes to give a speech on Flag Day, you don't think that would happen? No more genocide in our name. That July, in the Lou Harris poll, looking at the public's confidence in the government from 1966 to 1975, reported that confidence in the military during that period had dropped from 62% to 29%, in business from 55% to 18%, in both president and Congress from 42% to 13%. Perhaps much of the general dissatisfaction was due to the economic state of most Americans. Inflation and unemployment had been rising steadily since 1973, which was the year when, according to a Harris poll, the number of Americans feeling alienated and disaffected with the general state of the country climbed from 29% in 1966 to over 50%. In the year 1976, with the presidential election approaching, there was worry in the establishment about the public's faith in the system. William Simon, Secretary of the Treasury under both Nixon and Ford, spoke in the fall of 1976 to a business council meeting in Hot Springs, Virginia. He said that when so much of the world is lurching towards socialism or totalitarianism, it was urgent to make the American business system understood, because private enterprise is losing by default in many of our schools, in much of the communications media, and in a growing portion of the public consciousness. That is literally what's happening right now. I'm tired of saying that. I'm so tired of saying that, but I need y'all to understand. This is 1976. We are in 2024. You don't think that they're having those same conversations right now? Okay, so William Simon, the Secretary of the Treasury under both Nixon and Ford, was talking about the fact that, like, yo, we need to do something about the fact that so many people don't believe in government. So many people are against business. We need to figure out what we're going to do because the world seems to be lurching towards socialism or totalitarianism. We have to do something about this. His speech will be taken to represent the thinking of the American corporate elite. He said, Vietnam, Watergate, student unrest, shifting moral codes, the worst recession in a generation, and a number of other jarring cultural shocks have all combined to create a new climate of question and doubt. It all adds up to a general malaise, a society-wide crisis of institutional confidence. Too often, Simon said, Americans have been taught to distrust the very word profit and the profit motive that takes our prosperity possible, to somehow feel the system that has done more to alleviate human suffering and privation than any other is somehow cynical, selfish, and amoral. We must, Simon said, get across the human side of capitalism. Keep in mind that William Simon, before he became Secretary of the Treasury, was an investment banker earning over $2 million a year. Just keep that in mind, okay? The only people who think like that are people who are making a lot of money. Fucking nuts. Critical in all this was the decline in the authority of the president and, To the extent that the United States was governed by anyone during the decades after World War II, it was governed by the president acting with the support and cooperation of key individuals and groups in the executive office, the federal bureaucracy, Congress, and the more important businesses, banks, law firms, foundations, and media, which constitute the private sector's establishment. And that was written by Samuel Huntington, a political science professor at Harvard and longtime consultant to the White House on the war in Vietnam. Huntington further said that the president to win the election needed the support of a broad coalition of people. This coalition must include key people in Congress, the executive branch, and the private sector, establishment. What worried Huntington was the loss in governmental authority. For instance, the opposition to Vietnam had brought the abolition of the draft. Listen to this. Listen right now. The question necessarily arises, however, whether, if a new threat to security should materialize in the future, as it inevitably will at some point, the government will possess the authority to command the resources as well as the sacrifices which are necessary to meet that threat. The opposition to Vietnam had brought the abolition of the draft. He was worried that in the future there would be a situation where war would be necessary. And the fact that we didn't have a draft law worried him because of the sacrifices that were necessary to meet that threat. What does that mean? Decode that. What are the sacrifices that would be necessary to meet that threat, and who would make those sacrifices? Huntington saw the possible end of that quarter century when the United States was the hegemonic power in a system of world order. His conclusion was that there had developed an excess of democracy. And he suggested desirable limits to the extension of political democracy. Huntington was reporting all of this to an organization that was very important to the future of the United States. Wait till you find out who was in this organization. As we'll see here, Samuel Huntington, a political science professor at Harvard and a longtime consultant to the White House on the war in Vietnam, right? Go to the previous video to hear what he had to say about what needed to be done to address the fact that people were not as patriotic as they should be, and his worries about the fact that in the future there would be wars that would not have the number of people present for those wars that would be necessary to make the sacrifices to meet the threat. And my question to you last video was who and what are those sacrifices? Who is making those sacrifices, and what exactly are the sacrifices that you're talking about, that he's talking about? But he's speaking on behalf of the establishment, right? So Huntington was reporting all of this, everything that he's been talking about, to an organization that was very important to the future of the United States. The Trilateral Commission was organized in early 1973 by who? David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Rockefeller was an official of the Chase Manhattan Bank and a powerful financial figure in the United States and the world. Brzezinski, a Columbia University, what did I just say? It's always one of these professors at an Ivy League that's up to some weird shit. He was a Columbia University professor specialized in international relations and was a consultant to the State Department. Sidebar, the reason I didn't do shit with my IR degree is because the moment I got out of school, the moment that I got out of that sphere and went into the real world, I realized that I would have to make certain decisions. I wanted so badly to work for the UN until it clicked for me what was going on. I wanted so badly to work for NGOs until it clicked for me what they were actually doing and who was giving these NGOs money. So it's not surprising that this guy specialized in international relations, because I was so naive to think that international relations and a lot of the people that are in that political science world give a fuck about trying to make this world better and coming up with solutions. But in reality, it is just to keep shit the same. As reported in the Far Eastern Economic Review by Robert Manning, the initiative for the commission came entirely from Rockefeller. According to George Franklin, the commission's executive secretary, Rockefeller was getting worried about the deteriorating relations between the United States, Europe, and Japan. Franklin explained that Rockefeller began to present his ideas to another elite fraternity at the Bilderberg Group, a very distinguished Anglo-American group which had been meeting for a long time. Mike Blumenthal said he thought things were in a very serious condition in the world, and couldn't some kind of private group do more about it? So then David again made his proposal. Then Brzezinski, a close friend of Rockefeller's, carried the Rockefeller-funded ball and organized the commission. It seems probable that the very serious condition mentioned as reason for the Trilateral Commission was the need for greater unity among Japan, Western Europe, and the United States in the face of much more complicated threat to tricontinental capitalism than a monolithic communism. Revolutionary movements in the Third World. These movements had directions of their own. Okay, this is the final video for chapter 20. We just talked about the Trilateral Commission, right? Who was the head of the Trilateral Commission? David Rockefeller. He brought one of his homies in who was a professor at Columbia. And it's like, the more I think about the present moment, I'm like, why did Columbia treat the students the way that it did? Because Columbia, from the inception, has been entrenched in aligning itself with the positions of government. And when I say government, I'm basically referring to the establishment. The establishment, again, is not the people. The establishment is media, it's wealthy people, law firms, the ultra wealthy, banks, that kind of thing. Those are not me and you, right? And I think that that is part of what is going on right now at the present moment, is that so many of us are realizing we are part of a system that says that it works on our behalf, but it clearly does not. It is operating to keep things the same and to keep things beneficial for people who get to exploit us, for people who get to decide how society functions without actually thinking about our well-being. We just learned about how the big milk corporations to Nixon's campaign gave $400,000, and because of that, in return got $500 million in profit, when everyday people had to pay more money for milk when they were already having such a difficult time dealing with inflation, all that shit. It's not about us. It's not about making it easier for us. We just learned about the oil and what was going on with Aramco, and how they were like, oh, let's slow down oil production so we can get more money, even though people need oil for cars and they need to get to work and all that shit. It doesn't matter. It's about money. It's about money. And I'm gonna be honest with you, the fact that I'm even speaking to you in this way, it's not that it's unlike me, but I don't typically speak this way publicly because I don't like to pour more energy into things that are not going well, or to like rile people up in ways that are not necessarily positive. But the more I learn, the older I get, the more I realize you cannot love and light your way through everything. There are just some things you have to look at it for what it is so that we can strategize and think about how we're going to make the world better. And this is one of those things. I know that this is not fun. None of this is fun to read. None of this is fun to have to sit with. But it is what it is. You and I are existing in this timeline right now. We are part of a community, whether we like it or not, whether we look the same or not, whether we grew up the same or not. Decisions are impacting you and I. Some of those decisions impact us differently based on our class, based on our race and all of that. But at the end of the day, you and I don't belong to this group that they're talking about. We don't belong to the Trilateral Coalition. We don't belong to the banks that get to talk to the president. You know what I mean? We have to pay the higher prices for milk. We have to pay the higher prices for oil. We're the ones that just have to deal with the consequences of whatever they decide. We have to think critically about the position that we are in. We have to think more critically about how we can opt out of things that are not helpful to us. We have to think more critically about how we can opt into each other so that we can make our lives easier to offset these intentions. Do you know what I'm saying? Do you understand what I'm saying? This is why I'm so enraptured by the idea of collectivism and community as the word intends to insinuate, not community as like the cute phrase, but community as in like I show up for you and you show up for me, because this is already hard enough. We're already up against too much. How about we lean into each other so that we can start balancing some things out, and so we don't have to depend on this so much. The Trilateral Commission apparently saw itself as helping to create the necessary international links for the new multinational economy. Its members came from the highest circles of politics, business, and media in Western Europe, Japan, and the United States. They were from Chase Manhattan, Lehman Brothers, Bank of America, Banque de Paris, Lloyd's of London, Bank of Tokyo, etc. Oil, steel, auto, aeronautic, and electric industries were represented. Other members were from Time Magazine, The Washington Post, the Columbia Broadcasting System, Die Zet, I'm assuming that's German. The Japan Times, The Economist of London, and more. 1976 was not only a presidential election year, it was the much anticipated year of the bicentennial celebration. It was filled with much publicized events all over the country. The great effort that went into the celebration suggests that it was seen as a way of restoring American patriotism, invoking the symbols of history to unite people and government, and put aside the protest mood of the recent past. But there did not seem to be great enthusiasm for it. When the 200th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party was celebrated in Boston, an enormous crowd turned out, not for the official celebration, but for the people's bicentennial counter-celebration, where packages marked Gulf Oil and Exxon were dumped into the Boston harbor to symbolize opposition to corporate power in America. That's the end of chapter 20. This is 1976 we're talking about. The next chapter is titled Carter, Reagan, Bush, the Bipartisan Consensus. This next chapter is about 30 pages. Let's see, it starts on page 564. Yeah, it ends on page 600. So I feel like chapter 21 is going to be another part 1, part 2 situation. I already started reading it, but I'm going to try to get through at least half of it today so that I can start recording this week. My hope is to have chapter 21 up this week as well. We will see. We're so close to the end of this book. Let me know what you think about this chapter. Thank you for being here. As always, let me know what you're thinking. I have to pop into Patreon this week and chat with y'all. So if you want to have a more extensive conversation, let's talk about this over on Patreon. And yeah. The more things change, the more they stay the same.